Blind Maneuvers by Shauna E. Black. Chapter 1. The Phantom Nightingale. There were any number of ways Braid could spend his afternoon that were infinitely more pleasant than strolling through the muddy streets of a barter town. Covered in grease repairing the winch on the mainsail, for instance. Yet here he was in Roma, an outpost squatting on a meager peninsula of the empire that trafficked in everything from produce to metals to people. The black market was rumored to even dabble in trading children, the reason Braid and Xanth were here. Braid's misgivings weren't helped by the empty holster at his hip. He'd been obliged to hand over his stinger at the birth gate. Xanth had relinquished his saber as well, and Braid missed the comforting shape that usually skewed the tails of Xanth's long black coat. "Hold it!" Braid threw out a hand to stop Xanth from crossing a street. A long auto driven by a man wearing goggles and a silk scarf streaming in the wind roared past, splashing mud in all directions. In its wake surged a bevy of bicycles, pedestrians, and motorcycles spouting black smoke, all jockeying for position.
"We don't have time to spare."
Xanth's voice had a lilting accent and a mellow quality, like silk gliding over harp strings.
"That child's life could be in danger if Janko decides to sell to one of the underground factories instead of us."
Stepping into the path of a bicycle that was forced to swerve out of their way, Xanth forged into the melee, ignoring the mud that splashed across his boots and up onto his coat. Braid grumbled as he did his best to follow. His size made it difficult to keep up with his more nimble captain. The child's life might be in danger, but their entire crew would suffer the consequences if they got caught by the Roma Guard. Xanth wove himself between the bodies of the crowd like an acrobat, a veritable prince striding through the garish slums. All leather flaps and dark angles, he was thin as a whip and tall as a post. A pair of dark crimson spectacles glinted in the sun when he turned sharply in answer to Braid's warning to avoid an overturned cart of potatoes. As they advanced through the city, Braid's senses were assaulted with clashing colors and garish outfits pulsing in the bald sunlight. The smells of human waste mingled unpleasantly with fried food. Music and haggling voices pounded against his eardrums. "There it is!" Braid had to shout over the cacophony of the hawkers and the hum of 1,000 throats. 10 steps ahead to the right. The pub was located in a ramshackle building with an upper story sagging atop the first, as though pressed on by the thumb of a distracted giant. The official logo proclaiming this a place to drown one's sorrows hung askance on a crooked board looming over the street, ready to brain an unwary pedestrian. A child shouldn't be in such an establishment, but Braid had seen worse. He followed Xanth inside. The noise of the street was only slightly subdued as the door banged shut behind them. The room was crowded with patrons chattering and laughing as they sat gambling at round tables. A piano badly in need of tuning played merrily from the corner with a group of women singing along at the top of their lungs, the words bawdy enough to bring a blush to Braid's cheeks. He ignored the blonde waving him over and focused on picking a path through the maze of tables. "The counter's to the left," Braid said as he followed Xanth. 4 paces around a table straight ahead. He averted his eyes from the couple snogging on top of the table. The bar was a standard variety, with a long counter stained by years of spilled alcohol and dusty bottles cluttered in rows on a shelf along the far wall. Braid made room for them at the bar by glaring at the nearby patrons until they shifted aside. An eager attendant with strands of greasy hair scuttled from a swinging door behind the bar and approached.
"Can I help you, young sirs?"
"We're looking for Janko,"
Xanth said.
"Janko? Never heard of him."
Braid placed both hands on the countertop and leaned in so that his leather vest creaked over his bulging muscles. "We have an appointment." The attendant sneered.
"Is that so?"
With long, slim fingers, Xanth deliberately pulled his spectacles off, revealing his eyes. They were blind, a milky white with fragments of color dancing subtly in the depths. Together with his pale skin and deep auburn hair, his appearance hinted at his ethereal origins. The attendant's smile fell right off his face. He trembled.
"It can't be. We heard you were shot down over Leon."
"Obviously,"
Xanth said.
"that rumor was false."
The man stammered something about returning in a moment and made a hasty retreat. Braid put his back to the bar and leaned into it, intimidating any patrons who dared to show interest in his conversation. "This is a bad idea," he mumbled to Xanth. Xanth slid his spectacles carefully back into place.
We've come this far. We might as well go through with it.
"It smells like a trap."
Of course it does. I wouldn't have come otherwise.
Braid let out an exasperated breath. "What?" Xanth flexed his fingers.
Traps often have live bait.
His words did nothing to loosen the knot in Braid's stomach. If anything, it got tighter. He clenched and unclenched a fist, wishing more than ever it held his stinger.
Keep your top on, Braid.
Xanth's calm tone was irritating.
I know what I'm doing.
"Yeah, that's what you always say." The attendant reappeared on their side of the counter. His mouth stuttered into an obsequious smile as he asked them to follow him to a narrow hallway. Xanth didn't move like a blind man as he swayed around obstacles, walking with a confident stride Braid quickly matched. 6 paces, Braid said automatically. "Through a door." As they crossed the threshold, the door swung closed behind them. The noise quieted considerably, and the light dimmed. They were in a large, unfinished chamber with supporting beams stretching 2 stories up to the roof. It was cluttered with barrels and crates, damaged furniture, and piles of broken glass. The boards on the back wall had gaps, showing glimpses of the alley behind the building. The crisp cold of late autumn and the alley stench seeped in to permeate the room. It was as if they'd just been swallowed whole and were now being digested in a monster's belly. "Stairs," Braid said, as he watched the attendant scurry up a staircase to a landing above.
Rickety ones,
Xanth added sardonically. Braid quirked an eyebrow. "How?" Xanth gave a casual shrug as he and Braid followed the attendant up the steps.
They squeal like a banshee.
The hinges on the door above shrieked just as loud when the attendant opened it.
I brought him.
His voice quivered more than the stairs. Instead of following the attendant immediately through the door, Xanth paused on the landing.
Braid, the room?
He murmured. Braid peered over Xanth's shoulder through the narrow opening the attendant had left. It wasn't very often Xanth requested a description. "I can't see much," he said. "Looks like a window on the far side with an empty chair straight ahead."
How many paces?
"I'd say 6.
Good enough.
Xanth put out a hand to push the door all the way open. He moved slower than usual and stumbled a little before he seated himself in the chair. Braid frowned. Something was wrong, but he didn't have time to puzzle out what it was. Forgetting his concern, Braid brushed past the attendant and put on a menacing expression. He crossed the room and came to a stop behind Xanth's chair, folding his arms and flexing his muscles. Xanth had said their first impression would be critical to getting the child out. Now that he was in the room, Braid could see the rest of it. The ceiling sloped down to a petite dormer looking out over a side street. What little sunlight penetrated the filthy window panes was choked with dust eddying in the air currents of their entrance. Streaks of coal on the peeling wallpaper gave evidence the fireplace had once been used, but the room was cold. Beside the empty hearth in a wingback chair, a man as tattered as the room itself sat contemplating them over hands encased in fingerless gloves, the dirty nails tapping together in a steepled formation. He wore a gray wool coat and the squat hat of a military leader, though the hat appeared neglected and stained like the rest of him. The entire effect resembled nothing so much as a dusty old spider, contemplating its latest catch.
"Ah, the phantom nightingale,"
he rasped. Xanth nodded.
Janko.
"You're younger than I expected."
I'll take that as a compliment.
"Yes. Well,
Janko's eyes narrowed.
I've been following your exploits by the underground wireless, though the Tyrian fleet seems to consider you more of a nuisance than a real threat. How galling that must be for a vigilante like yourself."
No more galling than a disgraced sergeant subsisting off black market scraps on the fringe of a Tyrian barter town.
Janko's expression soured, as though he'd bit his own tongue.
I didn't come to exchange pleasantries.
Xanth continued. The hard tone belied his relaxed posture. Janko cleared his throat and regained his veneer of calm.
"Right to the point. I like that. Shows you're a businessman."
He waved a hand at the attendant.
"Fetch it in here."
To Xanth he added,
This one was caught wriggling under the fence at Adelbrook. Scrawny little thing. I don't know why the CCA even bothered with it. But reports say you aren't choosy about the kids you take on. In fact, the scrawnier, the better.
His grin showed teeth blackened with tar that hadn't seen the right end of a brush in too many days. The attendant reappeared, yanking the arm of a small figure, towing it after him. At the sight, Braid took an involuntary step forward. Xanth made a slight hissing noise. Although Braid quickly resumed his threatening stance, Janko must have noticed. Braid's fist tightened. Stupid and impulsive, it would cost them bargaining power. A girl of about 6 years old turned frightened eyes on them. She wore the nondescript uniform of a factory worker, the plain cotton ripped and sullied. The girl was young, younger than any child in a factory had a right to be. Braid's muscles quivered. Don't hit, Janko. Not yet, anyway. The child visibly shivered, teeth chattering in a quiet staccato. Xanth stood and pulled the coat off his shoulders to swing it around her. So much for gaining bargaining power by feigning disinterest. All congeniality lost, Xanth's tone became hard, raw, anger.
Did you house the poor child in an icebox, Janko?
Braid was glad to drop the pretense that they weren't interested in making a deal with Janko to free this girl. He reached for her, but Janko put up a hand, and the attendant stepped in front of her. Braid hesitated. While he could have swept the man aside with a single blow, he waited for a signal from Xanth. Xanth straightened slowly, head cocked slightly toward Janko.
How much?
Janko chuckled. It was an eerie sound, like bare tree branches scraping together on a windy night.
This is a 2-for-1 special, Nightingale.
I'm not interested in changing the deal. How much?
Janko allowed an uncomfortable silence to blanket the room. Braid's frustration rose like bile in his throat. He wanted to throttle the smile off the old man's face, but he tightened his fists until the knuckles cracked. If he ruined this, the girl would suffer for it. Janko seemed unruffled.
You understand, Nightingale, that there are others who will pay handsomely for a runaway with her skills. I hope you will have the patience to hear me out.
Xanth crossed his arms over his chest, echoing Braid's earlier stance.
I'm listening.
Janko's smile grew, showing chipped and missing teeth in the recesses.
I have a piece of information I think you'll find quite valuable.
Xanth gave Braid a nod. At last! Braid crossed to Janko in 2 long strides, grabbed him by the arm, and yanked him out of his crumbling chair before the man could blink. Janko's arm felt sinewy and skeletal beneath the rough wool of his coat. That cocky smile faltered. Braid gave him a rough shake for good measure. The attendant squeaked like a frightened rat and jumped out the door, slamming it behind him. The little girl huddled lower in Xanth's coat, almost disappearing.
I grow weary of your games, Janko.
Xanth whispered.
I could just take the child and go.
Janko growled and yanked his arm away from Braid's grip. Braid let him. This close, Janko's smell of stale cabbage and sausage grease was faintly nauseating anyway. Straightening his coat, Janko brushed some of the dust off. Not that his attempts helped his appearance any.
I'll call the guards.
Xanth's voice pulsed with quiet menace.
Do you really want to show them the back rooms of this place?
Janko wasn't cowed.
They can be here in 10 seconds.
We'll be gone in 5, Braid interjected. Janko's eyes narrowed until they were no more than slits.
Really? That would be a shame. Then you would never hear this interesting tidbit. And believe me, Nightingale, you want me to tell you all about it.
Xanth's confident stride brought him nose to nose with Janko.
Then tell me.
Janko rubbed his fingertips together.
It'll cost you.
Braid?
Braid yanked the purse off his belt. How much?
All of it,
Xanth said. Braid blinked, not sure he'd heard correctly. All of it?
Yes.
Trying not to think about how many coins he'd stuffed into the purse, Braid slowly placed the pouch in Janko's outstretched hand. The fingers closed around it like claws. With a widening grin, Janko yanked the mouth of the pouch open and poked one dirt-encrusted finger inside.
Tyrian gold, I assume?
The man practically drooled.
Of course.
Janko pulled out the coins. They glittered in the dim light, newly minted with the stern profile of Chancellor Voss, ruler of the Tyrian Empire that had engulfed the European continent in the global war some 20 years ago. Janko's lips moved as he silently counted. Finally, he stepped back and sketched a bow.
A pleasure doing business.
The information?
Xanth demanded. Janko looked between them as if measuring them up for sale on his black market.
Ah, yes.
The look of the spider returned.
My sources have informed me that there have been a surprising number of earthquakes in the capital city.
Xanth raised an eyebrow.
What's so strange about that? Earthquakes happen everywhere, even in the no-slip zones.
Janko's smile deepened.
But some of these are strong, up to a 6 on the Richtmograph. The epicenter has been pinpointed at Jugend Academy. It's all very hush-hush, you understand. There's been no official acknowledgement that anything is amiss. The Empire is hiding something.
The Empire is always hiding something.
Braid growled. This is hardly worth a purse full of coins.
But this is.
Janko bowed his head in deference.
My sources say there is a young lady in the Academy's upper class who wears a bracelet of green stones.
Braid caught his breath. Even Xanth lost his cool veneer.
Tyrians would never allow an Andal to set foot in one of their academies, let alone train in the upper class, especially Jugend.
Believe what you will,
Janko continued smoothly.
I'm merely the messenger. I trust this information met with your satisfaction.
Xanth gave a single nod.
Then I will bid you farewell. My assistant will return shortly to escort you out.
We can see ourselves out, Braid growled. Janko protested a little too quickly.
I think not. You gentlemen wouldn't want to attract unwarranted attention. We have a more discreet exit.
As Janko minced through the door, Braid was distracted from his misgivings by the familiar fervor in Xanth's expression. You're not serious, Braid said. Xanth smoothed the brocade of his vest.
We can't ignore it.
This will be like all the others, Xanth. The last time we went on one of your wild goose chases, we were nearly grounded when that destroyer popped out of nowhere. We can't outrun those things.
But we can outmaneuver them.
And what if you're caught this time? Do you want to become a slave to the Tyrians like all the other Andal? Xanth didn't answer, so Braid turned away and started to pace. If the Tyrians are hiding an Andal in the most prestigious academy in the Empire, that means they're up to something. Something big. We shouldn't go blundering into the middle of it.
Maybe the Tyrians aren't the ones hiding the girl.
Are you kidding me? Braid's nails dug into the palms of his hands. Janko said she's wearing Moldavite crystals. Who else would control an Andal that way?
They could be emeralds.
But they're not. The little girl had crammed herself into a corner, probably frightened by their argument. Braid stopped pacing. He took a deep breath and forced a more reasonable tone. It's been 10 years, Xanth. You've got to admit that your sister is lost. For good. Xanth's expression hardened, his long mouth becoming a thin line, his brow furrowing down behind the spectacles.
I won't give up, Braid,
he whispered.
Not ever. Not if I have to scour every last inch of this wretched empire. I vowed to find her. And that is what I will do, even if it takes 100 years.
Braid ran a hand through his tan hair. Rescuing older kids always ends badly. They're too steeped in Tyrian lies.
If she's causing earthquakes that big, she needs my help, Braid.
Xanth moved toward the window as he spoke, head swiveling as though he were searching for something.
Besides, you weren't exactly a spring chicken when I found you, but you're the best first mate I've ever had.
The memory of that dark pit where Xanth had rescued him sent heat creeping up Braid's neck. Are you calling me old? Who just turned the wrong side of 20? Xanth's smile was fleeting.
You're only a couple of years behind me.
3 years, Grandpa. Count 'em and weep. Braid checked the door handle. Locked. It looks like there's a fire escape out that window.
It's too late for that.
Sweat broke out on Braid's forehead. Why?
The Roma Guard has just arrived.
Chapter 2. The Steam Well. Aveline hadn't been in the steam well since she was a small child, but it was the only other place Lorelei might be. Little more than a service shaft, the steam well rose through the centre of Jugend Academy, From the lowest basement all the way to the top, 50 stories high, the chug and hiss of engines masked the crash of the heavy metal door as Aveline stepped inside the entrance. Opening the door had been a trick. If Lorelei had come here, she was more desperate than Aveline gave her credit for. The air was hot and humid, enveloping her lungs and tickling her mind with memories like wisps of ghostly fingers. Her eyes were unable to penetrate the gloom, even after several moments to adjust. As a child, she'd often stolen an electric torch when she and Lorelei played hide-and-seek here, but she had other tools now. Aveline pulled off her gloves and tucked them into the pocket of her uniform. If she didn't find Lorelei, Superintendent Proteus would have her head. The last time Lorelei disappeared, Proteus broke a blood vessel and demoted Aveline to cadet. A second infraction would be worse. He might end her military career altogether. Her only consolation then would be escaping the dominance of the Jugend Academy superintendent. But it wasn't her preferred method. There were other ways to gain her freedom from Proteus. Aveline removed the squat hat that matched her short blue skirt, replacing it with a pair of goggles from the pouch at her belt. The rubber strap caught on her red hair, threatening to pull it from the elaborate braids wound around her head. But she patiently worked it free. With a thumb, she found the tiny lever to drop down the night vision lens, and the room's contents swam out of blackness into a green haze. Metal beams and long pipes like snakes spat steam and went writhing out the walls to the academy. Engines on the basement floor rotated laboriously, pistons whining. The square bodies of Autobots slid on their tracks through the room, feeding and oiling the machines, belching steam to rise in lacy curls before being slowly sucked out through ventilation shafts placed all along the walls. There was no wallpaper here, no plush carpeting and marble tiles, no chandeliers. She had missed these simple lines of unadorned machinery. But the indulgent pleasures of childhood were something an upperclassman could not afford. With a sigh, Aveline turned to climb a ladder fastened to one wall. The cold metal stung her bare hands. Her boots slid on the rungs, but she managed to reach the first floor. Through the lens of her goggles, the letters and numbers stenciled on the side of a beam to mark the level glowed faintly. A square airshaft burrowed out to the more inhabited areas of the academy. Aveline eyed it askance. She and Lorelei had scampered through these shafts easily enough as children, but they were both taller now, filled out in all the right places. Even with her slighter build, Lorelei would not have gotten far. It had been a foolish idea to come here. Lorelei often acted as though she didn't even remember the adventures they'd shared in their childhood, avoiding lessons and the ever-watchful eye of Superintendent Proteus. It would never occur to the mature Lorelei to hide here, would it? Aveline had one booted toe on the lower rung, about to scamper down the ladder to search elsewhere, when she felt it. A mild ache around her ears that slowly invaded her thoughts. Aveline paused. Perhaps she should ignore the feeling, return to Proteus, and report that Lorelei was nowhere to be found. But the mere thought of his wrath made her quail inside. She didn't have the courage to face that.
I'm surprised you can still fit in there.
Aveline shouted over the engines. Her voice came out in a scratched whine. It was never very strong and only got worse when she yelled. In answer, the beam of an electric torch blossomed in the shaft, veering around until it pinpointed Aveline.
I might have known you'd find me here. Can't you just leave me in peace for once?
At least you're not snogging some boy again, are you?
Aveline shoved her night goggles up onto her forehead.
He'd have to be awfully skinny.
Don't be silly. Carl and I broke up last week.
So you're due for another one.
Aveline took a deep breath.
Come along, Lorelei. You know you can't avoid it.
There was a loud hiccup that echoed and bounced off the airshaft before it reached Aveline.
I can't sing when I'm upset.
Aveline found herself clicking her fingernails against the metal rung and forced herself to stop.
Proteus won't accept that excuse.
The metal rang with sudden movement, and the torch beam wavered wildly, revealing glimpses of Lorelei's blonde tresses above the glaring grey eyes of their owner as she scuttled to the mouth of the shaft. Aveline leaned back to give her room.
Why must you drag me back to him?
Lorelei spat.
Can't you help me for once? You're as awful as he is.
The words sliced through Aveline. There had been a time when she and Lorelei had planned to escape together, but those dreams were as childish and fleeting as the torn scraps of paper on which they'd been drawn. Aveline's only hope of freedom was without Lorelei. As Proteus's tool, Lorelei was much too valuable to lose, but he wouldn't send a skyhound after Aveline alone. Her chest seemed encased in lead whenever she thought about leaving Lorelei behind.
I know this is hard,
Aveline said carefully.
but you have to keep trying. Proteus promised you special privileges if you're successful.
The lead tightened around her heart. It was a lie, but one Lorelei would readily accept. To ease her own conscience, Aveline reached out and brushed Lorelei's hand on the torch with a tentative finger. It was a mistake. Lorelei's muscles tensed. Aveline caught Lorelei's other hand mid-motion and pressed the wrist until the tiny dirk Lorelei held dropped from her fingers. It clattered against the metal walls of the shaft on its way to the floor. Lorelei's shoulders hitched in a giant sob, and she threw her arms around Aveline, torch and all.
I'm sorry.
Her tears drenched the gold braiding of office decorating Aveline's uniform.
I really don't want to hurt you.
You never do.
Aveline pushed Lorelei gently back before the braiding got plastered in mascara. She swiped at the tears on Lorelei's cheeks, fighting the suffocating frustration around her own heart. Escape from Proteus meant more than just freedom. It meant liberation from her enforced role as Lorelei's jailer.
But I understand why you do it. Maybe this experiment will be the final one.
There will never be a final one.
Aveline pursed her lips. If she didn't get Lorelei moving, there would be serious consequences.
I know what will cheer you up,
she said.
I'll sing your favorite song.
Lorelei's eyes popped with horror.
No, please, don't torture me.
But you love it so much, especially my rendition.
Aveline opened her mouth and started to sing in a low country twang.
On a dark night, bereft of light, she came to her lover fair. The air was still, her heart a-thrill, as she minced down the salty stair.
Aveline's voice had been full of gravel for nearly 8 years. It was a constant reminder of the failure she'd been to Proteus. She had once been useful like Lorelei, able to slip to locations using only her voice, but now, whenever she tried to sing, the melody was barely recognizable, and the power was completely gone. Lorelei laughed, clamping hands over Aveline's mouth and nearly knocking her from her perch on the ladder.
Stop, I give in. I'll go back upstairs, I promise.
Aveline quit singing and helped Lorelei clamber out of the air shaft onto the rungs. When they reached the concrete floor, Aveline pulled the heavy door open for Lorelei and blinked in the sudden light of the hallway outside. The basement was usually deserted, which was why it made such a good hiding place. The walls were painted a simple white. The only people who ever came down this far were the archive directors and the mechanics who serviced the Autobots. Aveline used to pretend she and Lorelei could live down here, sneaking food from the kitchens and building nests in the air shafts. Though now she understood the folly of that idea, she had a new plan to escape the academy for good. If only it were possible to take Lorelei with her. But Proteus would never allow Lorelei to leave, unless her powers broke. Aveline removed her goggles as the heavy door clanged shut behind her. Several paces away, Lorelei stopped and turned around. Her uniform was filthy, grease stains smudged across the tight-fitting red and blue checked coat, cobwebs in the frilly white cravat, and a tear in the blue skirt. Lorelei's face was red and splotchy under the grime, though it detracted little from her frail beauty. Her lower lip trembled.
I'm scared, Aveline.
Of course you are. We both are.
What if I can't ever do it right again?
You'll get it this time, Lorelei. I know it.
Aveline eyed the rumpled and sullied state of Lorelei's uniform.
But you'd best get cleaned up before you go to the laboratory. I have a task to perform first, so I'll send Roland to keep an eye on you.
Lorelei's expression took on a mischievous glint, and she began to twirl the electric torch.
Roland, he has the dreamiest eyes.
Aveline cocked one brow sharply. Lorelei was recovering quickly from her fear.
You know we're dating, right? Besides, Proteus will flog you alive if you flirt with your guard again.
Lorelei turned around, strolling down the corridor in a way that made her boots seem like slippers, and sent the folds of her skirt swishing around her knees.
You mean he'll have you flogged for neglecting your duty? See you upstairs.
Aveline stood there, fists clenching and unclenching as she watched Lorelei sashay down the hall and turn a corner. Maybe it would be best to send Hannah instead.
Chapter 3. Dodging Bullets. Braid crossed the room in 4 long strides and stared out the dormer window. A contingent of Tyrian guards rounded a corner below, doing double time, headed for the pub's entrance. They carried rifles and wore dark blue uniforms with white armbands displaying the red lion of the Tyrian Empire. That mealy little spider double-crossed us,
Where's the child?
Xanth asked. To your left about 3 paces. The kid is a girl, by the way.
I know.
It shouldn't have surprised Braid. After 3 years aboard the Carpathia, he'd witnessed Xanth's correct interpretation of sound often enough. Maybe it was the way the girl whimpered, or the tone Janko had used when referring to her. Xanth simply knew things. Now he turned and approached the girl, kneeling in the dust to place a fumbling hand on her shoulder. Though her pallor seemed peaked under her olive complexion, she didn't flinch.
My lovely, listen to me very carefully. We will take you to a place of safety, but you must first trust us. In a moment, guards will be here to return you to Adelbrook. We don't want that to happen. Will you come with us?
The girl studied Xanth. That close, she would be able to see the glassy white of his eyes behind his spectacles, but she didn't seem shocked by it. She glanced over at Braid, then to Xanth.
Okay.
She whispered. Xanth smiled, the sun coming out from behind clouds.
There's a good girl.
He stood up, pulling his coat from her shoulders and shoving his arms back into the sleeves.
We can't go out that window. They'll have a sniper covering it.
Sure enough, Braid watched a guard peel off from the main group and slow at the corner to the intersection with the side street under their window. Can't you slip us out through the walls?
No. My hearing's dull. There's Moldavite built into the structure of this room.
Braid gaped. If you know that, then why?
It was the only way Janko would bring us the girl.
You remember I don't have my stinger, right? Braid grumbled, moving to the door and examining it. This thing swings inward. I can't force it. Xanth bent down and gathered the girl into his arms. She clung to him as though he were a lifeline in a vast ocean.
Just get us out of this room. I'll do the rest.
The stairs beyond the door protested as the heavy thuds of footsteps grew louder. Sidling up with his back against the door, Braid tensed his muscles. If you slip in front of the guards, they'll know you're Andal. The reedy voice of the attendant seemed all too near.
In here, officer!
Obviously they know already,
said Xanth. There was a scraping sound as a key turned in the lock.
You in the room!
Called a stern guard's voice.
Stand down in the name of Chancellor Voss and submit yourselves for arrest.
The door swung inward. Braid kicked it, slamming it into the soldier trying to enter. Immediately, Braid yanked the door back open, crouching low to avoid the fire of a rifle. Giving a guttural yell, Braid charged headfirst into the knot of guards on the landing. It caught them by surprise, and they stumbled back into the rickety railing of the stairs. The structure whined and groaned with the force and began to pull away from the wall. The attendant standing several steps below shrieked and made a run for the bottom. Braid's forward momentum carried him into the guards as he lost his balance, and the stairs fell. He tried to adjust his body to hit with the least impact. At least he'd be on top. But he never hit the ground. Xanth leapt out the doorway of the room behind Braid, already singing, It was a haunting melody in a language few had heard since the global war began. Xanth claimed his grandmother had taught it to him when he was small. It was the song of a lost people, trapped and longing for their homeland somewhere beyond the stars. With the girl in one arm, Xanth reached out to snatch Braid's belt strap in his long fingers. As soon as he took hold, Xanth slipped. Time grew sluggish, as though they'd been suddenly plunged into the ocean. The sensation only lasted a moment, then everything blurred like a smudged painting. When things came back into focus, they stood in the alley behind the pub. Fighting the familiar ear pop of exiting a slip, Braid tried not to stagger as the stench of the alley hit him. Xanth set the girl on the ground.
Get her to the Carpathia.
"What about you?" Braid asked. Xanth took up a firm stance, facing the north end of the alley.
I'll distract them.
"Don't get yourself killed. You owe me 2 kern from our poker game last night."
I would never dishonor a bet.
Xanth's grim smile belied the hurt in his words.
Or don't you believe I can dodge a few bullets?
"It's not the bullets I worry about. It's your energy level." Braid crouched next to the girl, telling her, "Climb onto my back and hold tight to my shoulders." A guard ran around the corner.
Halt in the name of Chancellor Voss.
Braid flattened himself with the girl against the wall of the pub.
Go!
Xanth's command turned into a song, his throaty baritone rising like the wail of a ghost. The guard aimed his rifle and fired. Xanth swung his arm in a wide arc and slipped at the same time. The bullet passed through the air where he had been and smacked into the wood paneling of the pub, not far from Braid's head. "Watch it!" he yelled. "I got a kid here!" The soldier was distracted from Braid by Xanth's reappearance. The man adjusted his aim and fired again. Like a dance, Xanth spun, disappearing and reappearing around the bullet. The guard's movements became jerky, his face reddening beneath the bowl of his helmet. He screamed for reinforcements. Braid didn't wait to see more. He took off at a dead run down the alley, gasping under the girl's grip on his neck, dodging piles of trash and broken wooden boxes. When he burst out into the street, he had to dive to the side to avoid a belching motorcycle. People were gathered around the pub in a knot, craning their necks to discover the source of the commotion. In the distance, a towering vertical dock rose more than 20 stories above the tallest building. Airships of all shapes and sizes drifted to and from the building's platforms. It was at least 10 city blocks away. Braid thundered across the street and into another alley, the child's legs supported by his arms. A guard shouted a warning to halt, but it only fueled the fire of Braid's pace. The pounding of boots on cobblestones spurred him on as he swerved across streets and down alleys, always keeping the dock in sight. The girl trembled, but she didn't cry out or scream. She seemed a brave little thing for being so small. He didn't want to think about the experiences that had forged that bravery. Eventually, Braid became aware of a fleeting shadow following in the wake of the guards, appearing and disappearing to accompanying bursts of sound. Now it was behind them. Now it weaved between the guards. Now it ran on a parallel course with Braid. Xanth. He appeared beside them, his dark coat flapping in his wake as he kept pace. When he moved like this, slipping to the sound of his voice, he ran as though his vision were as clear as anyone's. A sense of relief settled over Braid, in spite of the retort of a rifle whose bullet went wide and hit an apple cart to their left. They ducked into a side street and left the mess for the guards to stumble around. "You made it!" Braid panted. Xanth neatly leapt over a pile of excrement and turned down a narrow alley. He hardly seemed winded as he replied,
The fellow couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. The Tyrians really need to train their marksmen better.
"You can't blame them. They don't get much action so far from the—" Braid broke off as they ran into a central square. It was crowded, packed with people standing shoulder to shoulder, and moving at a glacial pace around carts hawking every type of ware from used books to tin lamps and glass trinkets. He stumbled to a halt, panting. The girl gave a squeak of alarm as the guards behind them entered the alley. "Xanth?" Braid said uncertainly. Xanth grabbed his arm and slipped. The surrounding motion slowed almost to a standstill as they slid through the people in the square. Before Braid got his bearings, They were on the other side of the crowd. Braid stretched his jaw to ease the ache in his ears and patted the girl's leg to quiet her whimpers. The throng would slow the guards, if not stop them altogether. The dock loomed huge over the rooftops. They were going to make it. Xanth led the way through the remaining streets until they burst out of another alley across from the dock. It was a hefty building. Massive steel beams left the interior exposed where people swarmed up and down stairs and steam-powered platforms that rose and fell along the entire length of the building. Airships rested on berth terraces around three sides of the structure like parasites, and the air hummed with the meshed harmonies of ships in flight. Most of the ships were small merchant vessels, but the gleam of steel marked a few Tyrian craft scattered among them.
"Get our papers ready,"
Xanth said, as they slowed to a brisk walk and crossed the street between breaks in the traffic. After putting the girl down on her feet, Braid rummaged in the pockets of his coat until he found the wad of papers shoved inside a leather billfold. They queued up to enter the building at the end of a line snaking down the sidewalk. The girl clung so tightly to the tail of Xanth's coat that her knuckles turned white. Braid couldn't stop himself from glancing over his shoulder at the alley from which they'd emerged. Had the guards gotten through the market crowd? How soon would they catch up?
"Quit acting suspicious,"
Xanth muttered. Braid let out a puff of breath and rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know how you can be so calm."
"I'm an excellent actor."
They finally reached the entrance booth and stepped up to the female Tyrian guard who held out a hand with a bored expression. Braid pressed their papers into it. He twisted the now empty leather billfold as she examined the text declaring them citizens of faraway Pembroke and the official Tyrian seal allowing them to travel.
"I don't see papers for the child."
Xanth reached down and gathered up the girl.
"My niece,"
he said smoothly, as though he didn't have a care in the world.
"My associate has her papers."
He tilted his head at Braid. Braid was already rummaging through his pockets again, his level of panic growing. Any minute now, the guards would burst out of the alley and yell at the woman to detain them. His fingers finally closed around the lost paper, and he yanked it out, tearing one corner a little. The woman frowned at him as she took it. Her bored expression was gone, eyes becoming small and shrewd. But she apparently found no fault with the forgery job Braid had picked up yesterday in Venuevo. She returned the papers to Braid and was just signaling the gatekeeper when the roar of a truck engine announced the arrival of a Tyrian contingent of soldiers. They poured out of the rear flaps of the truck as the commanding officer jumped from the passenger seat.
"Stop those men!"
Xanth grabbed Braid's arm. Before he could blink, they slipped through the people and onto a steam platform that was already rising up the dock building. The little girl gasped and clutched at Xanth, who patted her back.
"Your ears will recover in a moment."
Braid wobbled on his feet and caught his balance on the platform's guardrail. "You're pushing it," he complained to Xanth. "What if you drain yourself before we sail? We'll never escape the Tyrian galleons docked up there." Xanth's face was upturned, as though keeping their destination in sight.
"You worry like an old woman, Braid."
"Somebody's got to." The people on the platform stared at them, shuffling away as though faced with a deadly disease. Braid cursed and scanned the berth numbers as they glided past, but he was distracted by the soldiers below, who were forcing their way onto another platform. "That's not the city guard," Braid said. "They've brought in a troop of soldiers. They must have guessed where we were headed."
"More likely," Janko told them,
said Xanth. He shifted the girl's weight.
"Almost there,"
he said, voice soothing. The girl looked up and gave him a weak smile. Somehow kids always trusted Xanth. He exuded a calm reassurance like a glass of warm milk on a cold night. Finally, Braid spotted the giant 43 that marked their berth. He reached for the cord that would signal a stop request, but before he pulled it, there was a hissing sound and a grinding of gears, and their platform halted just 3 meters shy of the berth entrance. Braid hung over the guardrail, peering down. Soldiers swarmed up the stairs, moving to intercept them. None were yet in shooting range, but it wouldn't be long. Braid missed his stinger more than ever.
"Still think I should conserve my energy?"
Xanth asked with a wry smile. He didn't wait for an answer, but linked arms with Braid and slipped over the platform and upward in a burst of sound. ending well within the hallway leading to berth 43. They came out of the slip at a run, though Braid stumbled and nearly fell off the edge of the berth as they burst out onto the terrace holding their ship. The Carpathia sat lightly on its landing gear, a ramshackle craft put together with odds and ends that didn't always fit neatly, but there was a narrow grandeur about her, although she was well past her prime. 2 leaping dolphins were carved along the prow, creatures of legend said to have once inhabited the oceans before the ice caps melted. Some gilding was still visible on the ornately carved deck rail, along with most of the letters of her name, PCF Carpathia. Xanth swung the girl into Braid's arms and snatched up his saber from the weapons repository by the dock entrance.
Sakara, get us underway!
He gave a 2-handed swing at a mooring rope. It broke under the saber's edge with a snap and a twang, whipping like a writhing snake in its sudden freedom. Braid was aware of curious faces staring down at them from the ships perched on terraces above, but he ignored them and shifted the child to his hip so he could grab his stinger from the bin. It was the length of his hand, with a gleaming golden barrel tapering down to a point and a tube of charged gas under coils of silver wire. He jammed it into the holster on his other side and charged up the gangplank and into a virtual kicked anthill. Children and teenagers rushed in all directions, scuttling up and down the masts, tripping clasps, yanking on ropes, and loosening wires. Massive sails unfurled like butterfly wings on the main mast. Thin tubing along the edges of the sails began to glow as violet-colored gas was pumped through them, creating a rising hum of sound. The pilot box sat on top of a quarterdeck to the left in the stern. A girl in a frilly black and white number scrambled up the steps, while other youths poured out from an alcove beneath the quarterdeck. "Nuna!" Braid called to another girl scurrying past. The girl turned, teal skirts swirling around her calves. Nuna's brown hair was pulled into a bouncing ponytail, and she wore large spectacles that magnified her eyes. She looked like an owl as she blinked at him. "Get this kid below!" Braid thrust the child at her. Nuna gave the girl a kindly smile.
"Well, hello."
The child whimpered and reached for Braid.
"I want to stay with you."
"Go with Nuna." Braid gently pushed her away. "It's not safe for you up here."
"Come along.
Nuna crooned.
We'll find you a nice little nook while we get airborne."
Braid strode across the deck, pointing at a small girl that barely came to his waist. "Callie! Get your team into their wings. We need air support. There are soldiers right on our tails." Bobbing her head until her pigtails bounced, Callie raced off to lead several others to a storage box on the port side. "Tassadar!" A gangly teen with a mop of unruly curls and brown skin answered the summons. Braid slapped the boy on the shoulder. "Help the captain get those mooring lines free." Braid left Tassadar to it and scrambled up the steps to the pilot box. The young lady sitting in the chair was flipping levers and turning wheels almost faster than Braid could follow. She wore a squat hat, perched at a jaunty angle on her dark ringlets. Her dress was black and trimmed with white stripes, lace at the wrists of matching gloves and peeking over knee-high boots. Braid firmly believed that Sakara hoarded a magic trunk somewhere with an endless supply of clothes.
"What dung heap did you two step in this time?"
She asked in a voice almost like a child's, light and airy. "It seems this Janko thought to double his earnings by taking our coin and then tattling to the Tyrians."
"Makes sense.
Sakara said, tapping the radar instrument to bring it to life.
I'd probably do the same in his place."
Braid was about to give her a tart retort when the popping sound of a blunderbuss hitting the hull made the ship rock beneath his feet. He ducked and grabbed for the support rail around the pilot box. "As soon as the captain's aboard, get this tub in the air," he growled instead.
"That might be a problem."
He caught the tone of her voice, and his insides turned over. "Sakara!" She squirmed in her seat without looking at him.
"Now don't get upset. I had to give one of the Gessler tubes to the port master."
"What?" Blood rushed into Braid's cheeks.
"The docking fee seems to have increased since we were here last, and you didn't leave me enough coin."
"Sakara!"
"Weber's installing a dormant one. Once the captain charges it, we'll get airborne. Should take about 10 minutes.
"We don't have 10 minutes. As he spoke, Callie and the other 4 members of her wing crew swooped around the mast and dove toward the guards. Like miniature versions of the Carpathia's sails, The white wings sang with power from the Gessler tubes strapped to the wingers' backs. They each carried a thin rifle and began firing at will. The soldiers ran for cover before returning fire.
That'll buy us some time,
Sakara said with satisfaction. Not enough. Where's Weber?
Where else? The lower Gessler array.
Braid hardly waited for the reply before he was down the stairs, running for the alcove under the quarterdeck. Make a hole, he hollered. The young crew members scrambled to get out of the way as he thundered down the stairs. He barreled down 2 more decks, the music of the Gessler array growing louder, before he reached the hatch to the orlop. He slid through into the oblong basin of the Carpathia, where the sound was so loud he could almost touch it. After jumping off the ladder, he clamped his hands over his ears and made his way through the room, winding around work tables full of tools, wires, folds of sail, and spare parts. By a wide central column, a squat young man wearing goggles, heavy gloves, and a red cap carefully slid a long glass tube into the empty socket of a metal array holding 4 similar tubes, each pulsing with swirling clouds of violet gas. He snapped the tube into place and stepped back, closing the metal door around the array. The sound cut down to a merciful level, and Braid was able to drop his hands to his sides. "Are we ready to fly, Weber?" Braid asked impatiently. The boy looked up, startled, and pushed the goggles onto his forehead, making his brown bangs poke out at a crazy angle.
Braid, I didn't know you were back. Is the captain aboard?
Braid ignored the question. "We're under attack. We need to get the ship in the air."
Well, I suppose she'll fly without that last tube being charged, but it won't do us any good.
Weber pointed one gloved hand to the starboard side and a small round window. Braid reached it in 3 long strides. By craning his neck, he saw the adjacent angle of the dock building and the many ships perched on their terraces. A few stories below, a sleek metal craft was rounding the corner of the building, the sharp point of its bow aimed upward and coming at them. "Oh no."
That's a frigate,
Weber said grimly.
She'll have a rudder aboard.
"We won't make it this time," Braid muttered. A hand clamped down on his shoulder.
You lack faith, Braid,
Xanth said. Braid spun to face his captain. Xanth wore a tight smile, an expression Braid had witnessed dozens of times whenever they were in a rough spot. Braid shook his head. "We've never gone up against an Andal rudder before." Xanth quirked an eyebrow, the dark crescent rising above the rim of his round spectacles.
Just because it's never been done doesn't mean it can't be done.
He cocked his head.
Weber, let's give that frigate a run for its money. Braid, get up top and tell Sakara to head southwest, as though we're making a run across the Mediterranean Sea for Afri.
"What are you going to do?" Braid asked, mouth going dry. Xanth gave his shoulder a squeeze.
What I always do. Outmaneuver them.
Thanks for listening to this free sample of Blind Maneuvers by Shauna E. Black. This sample was produced by Vivienza Publishing with the assistance of 11 Labs. Text is copyrighted 2023 by Shauna E. Black. For more work by this author, visit her website at www.shaunablack.com.